All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Jacob Dunn. I'm working at ZGF Architects, and I'm creating this level setting video for the upcoming Leadership Summit for Climate, Wood, and Forests. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, bring up a presentation, and let's go ahead and present. All right. So this video focuses primarily on something we've been talking about in the procurement working group, which are different pathways to source climate smarter wood. And so this specifically focuses on disclosure and transparency approaches to wood sourcing. So trying to track wood back to the origin forest, and then what kind of performance requirements around climate smart forestry that we can potentially place once we attain those approaches. So a couple of shout outs to some colleagues that aren't with me. Marty Brennan at the ZGF office in Seattle, and then also Joe Zhang, one of the University of Washington architecture students that we've been pursuing a lot of this procurement research around. They've been pivotal in getting us to where we're at in terms of understanding the different pathways for this approach. So let's jump into it. We're seeing a lot of clients starting to really ask these questions more and more often around the simple prospect of, can we take the wood products that are in our buildings and trace them back through the supply chain to specific landowners that they're sourcing from? And that is, I think, a relatively simple question that has a very complicated answer, but this sort of represents the vision, right? This understanding that we can actually point up to a beam in our building or the wood structure and say that it came specifically from these types of forests. And so the goal really becomes trying to move beyond business as usual procurement, which allows you to kind of source and locate the source to the region based upon your mills and sort of the radiuses that they source from. You can say that it generally came from this area. With this approach, you can generally only guarantee sort of the legal minimum forestry per that state, and it's from a wide-ranging amount of sources, right? It's going to be lots of landowners that contribute to this, and there's going to be a spectrum of, conservation values that are within those harvest practices. So it's sort of a mixed bag. With direct sourcing, the idea is being able to tell that local story of, really where the wood came from, who it came from in terms of the landowner types and the kind of families or the organizations that you're supporting, then also hopefully knowing how the wood was actually harvested. And we'll sort of get into that here in a little bit, but this sort of represents conceptually, where we are typically and where we potentially could go. And we know this actually is really difficult because one of the primary methods of, sourcing back to the origin forest is through segregation, something that mills generally aren't set up to do, right? Because even though the mill knows very specifically where all of their logs and their log deck came from, right? They have lots of accounting to understand who they're buying from and when. Those logs get sorted in the log deck, not according to landowner, understandably, but more according to log characteristics, size, grade, diameter, lengths, so they can be, run through the mill as efficiently as possible. And then even on the back end, right, that lumber gets sorted into different sizes, different grades, and it's really a blend of all of those sources that are being fed into the mill. It's really all about efficiency. Wood has the wood industry has pretty tight margins, so efficiency really is a big deal. So what it takes to do direct segregation, right, is to actually put aside logs coming from a certain source, a compliant source, with whatever performance requirements, are set, putting it into a different part of the log deck so it can be ran separately in a batch process through the mill to where everything on the output side of the mill during that time period is from that particular source or mix of sources. It's less efficient, right? It takes a different sort of logistical attitude, and some mills are sort of set up to do this more easily than others. So it really depends on the mill. The size of the mill and the size of the project can make this either more or less of a hassle. So there's a lot of factors at play when even evaluating whether or not this is possible. But really, what we've been trying to flesh out is that that's one end of the spectrum, and really there's a lot of different approaches that we can start to take, maybe as baby steps, right, to get up to that point. But we're going to kind of run through these scenarios and talk a little bit about, what level of engagement is required behind them. So, when we think about one side of the spectrum as sort of this no transparency, or really it's regional transparency, right? We can source it back to the state or back to a particular region. You get what you get, right? It's that large, mix of landowner sources. Generally, you don't know sort of what those are if you don't ask, but you can generally say it came from this particular region. And then what we had just talked about on the other side of that spectrum is direct sourcing, and it sort of represents the kind of epitome of being able to track back to the source forests, where we're actually segregating specifically out landowners, from those compliant sources, batch processing them through the mill. So what ends up in our project is only from those sources that we had greenlit or that we'd worked with the mill to target. And we know that this can come with potentially added costs or increased logistics or difficulty in scheduling. But it's doable, but it does represent, the farther side of that spectrum. What's really interesting is when we start to think about kind of these two middle grounds. The one on the left is sort of just what we're calling mill input reporting. It really doesn't have a name at this point, right? So this is just sort of what we're using currently. But it's the idea of just asking the mill to kind of disclose the landowner sources for their wood basket, right? The kind of woodshed they had sourced from within a certain period of time that likely fed into your project, right? In this case, let's just say there are, 14 landowners that make that up. You can sort of take a look and analyze the quality of those sources, how they were harvested, and let's just say out of that, one of those landowners met that criteria. Depending upon the volume splits, the weighted volume splits, right, you can prorate that down to your project and make a claim of X percentage of your wood came from X type of sources, right? This represents, I think, a relatively easy way to kind of dip into this idea of tracking and transparency. It's an easier ask to a lumber mill, right? But it depends on if they want to disclose their sources, right? The kind of relationships they have with their landowners, whether or not they're willing to make that, public or semi-public. It could also be anonymized, so it could just be landowner type, so it actually doesn't have to be tracked back specifically, but it sort of depends on the kind of story you want to tell. But this represents, I think, a pretty easy step to start to get into this process. And I think this can be handled pretty easily through a decent spec that outlines this ask and potentially some reporting templates that can be included for the mills to kind of plug that information in to be able to output this information on the back end to tell the story. Taking that one step further is sort of this mill input reporting plus targeted sourcing. And, one analog to this is sort of the way that the sustainability industry has dealt with materials transparency and sort of healthy materials, right? The first ask was always about disclosure with, health product declarations, asking what's in the product. And the second step is sort of optimization, where you're trying to then start to screen for certain chemicals and optimize the, healthy materials that are used in the project or the formulations to make those particular materials. So this sort of follows a similar approach, but in this case, you're not asking the mill to segregate, but you're asking them to identify, that window of time where that woodshed is going to be used for the project, and then potentially to target sources either within their current supply chain, landowners that they source from, or to look outside of that, which is sort of a bigger ask to establish new relationships with landowners, but to target landowners that meet a certain criteria that you set forth. So you're sort of threading the needle in terms of engaging them and targeting those harvests to kind of flow into that wood basket during the time that's going to feed into your project, right? Easier than segregation, but it still does take a fair amount of engagement to determine which sources are compliant, depending upon, how complicated your sourcing requirements are, scheduling, and then just vetting that process. But no segregation required in that case. Now, so with this approach, let's just say now 3 additional landowners were able to be targeted during that time period. And then now that gets prorated through the mill. And then on the back end, you're able to make a claim on what percentage of your wood came from those particular compliant sources. And you can start to tell that story about where the wood came from, depending upon if you're getting specific landowner information or just anonymized landowner type and harvest information. It also requires some verification of those harvest practices, right, which can be tricky, which we'll get into on the next page. So there is sort of a level of verification that's needed that is also sort of outside typical procurement practices. So when we start to also think about, third-party consultants helping out with this process, I think for these right to scenarios, you definitely would need them. And then for the left to, I think you could actually just use specification language depending upon that process to make it happen. So really what we're trying to get to is two things. One is transparency and tracking. The second is influence, right? And trying to actually be able to have a positive influence on where wood's coming from to help increase that demand, help meet our clients' goals and start to move the industry in that particular direction, right? There's a reason why the summit is called a leadership summit, right? We're trying to understand what that vision could be and how to get there. So when we think about these types of approaches, these are the three on the right: mill input reporting, reporting with optimization, and segregation. The specifications and the way that we think about criteria can be divided into kind of transparency disclosure, specification language, and then also performance goal language. And the tricky thing about this is that it's hard to write a specification up front that is actually going to be useful, right? Because it really takes engagement within the supply chain to understand what's possible and what's available before you write a specification around that, especially with wood, because things are so variable depending upon, the product type, which fabricator you're going with, which mill they potentially source from, which region you're in. All those things are moving targets when it comes to performance criteria. So we'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide as well. But in general, if we start to simplify it just for the sort of thinking exercise, it's interesting to kind of try to follow the different pathways and sort of what performance opportunities become available depending upon which path you choose. So if you're thinking about mill input reporting or even just business as usual, you sort of get what you get, but you get more information about that. It's really hard to influence or direct that process, right? You're just asking for the mill to disclose information. So if there are sustainable harvesting requirements, you're sort of limited to, the current kind of process where you can choose certified wood products as one way to be able to claim those particular benefits. So that's what this orange arrow is sort of limited to choosing a certification as one of the primary ways to make that claim. In this case, we're showing FSC certification. Really, the criteria that we've set, this was for a specific project, but we know that that can be flexible depending upon, region and sort of product. So don't get hung up on the specifics of what we've set out, but just the process of using a certification to be able to make that claim. And then, of course, we can debate about which one of those makes sense on a case-by-case basis. There's a slight variation to where if you're doing mill input reporting, you can make additional claims if you're able to choose a mill that is sourcing primarily from sustainable forestry or climate smart forestry as well. It takes that sort of engagement and research up front, but it is possible to follow this pathway and get a little bit more flexibility than just choosing a certification. When we get into the mill input reporting with optimization, since we're actually can now target and engage the mill and ask them to target landowners that meet certain criteria, it opens up the ability to set additional sustainable harvesting goals and then also landowner diversity goals. In terms of sustainable harvesting, since you're kind of verifying from the source sort of various characteristics, whether it's landowner type or harvest practices, it opens up an entire sort of menu of compliance pathway options that you could set. So for instance, and this is just an example, right? It doesn't have to be these specific ones. We're talking about it could come from, you could still leverage FSC or other certification chain of custody programs. They could come just specifically from those types of forests that are certified. If you can track it back and verify through a different method, you can't claim that it's FSC or SFI or other fully certified products, but you know it came from a sustainable source. Federal restoration wood can be a potential target, salvage from wood, insect, fire, disease, or there's also a custom pathway where we could actually define harvest practices that we want to support and then verify if that landowner is actually using them for that particular harvest. So, then the mill would have to go out and, vet these sources either internally or externally to determine if they meet that criteria, and then thread that needle of getting it into their production cycle to kind of flow into your particular project. And that sort of works with either mill input reporting with optimization or segregation, right? The kinds of performance goals you set are very similar since we're going towards a targeted approach. And not only do these pathways allow you to set kind of additional criteria around harvesting, but also landowner diversity is something that our clients seem to be really interested in as well, in terms of trying to make sure X percentage of their wood comes from tribal sources has been pretty popular, small family farms, nonprofits, community forests. Right now that we're tracking back and potentially having the ability to influence where that wood comes from, we can set goals around potentially who we want to support economically and conceptually with the project. And we can also exclude certain types of either harvesting practices or landowner types if that's a route that you want to go. But yeah, this sort of represents the landscape of what's possible, and it gets complicated, right? It's very, very difficult to write a spec that kind of covers all of this in just a very kind of neat, particular language. And we've taken a couple cracks at it in terms of having a separate specification section that sort of outlines these different pathways. But it took a lot to get there, and it's sort of constantly evolving. So really, I think for the summit, I think one thing that we could focus on is this idea of kind of roadmaps versus specifications, at least at first, right? Understanding sort of what is the decision-making process for an owner or a team to determine what are those performance goals, right? Whether you're going with pathway 1, 2, 3, or business as usual, and then to understand what the kind of engagement processes and timelines are needed, with the fabricator, the mill, the landowners, the owner, third parties. It sort of is an entire process of like, when do you ask what questions and when do you understand whether pathway 3 is on the table versus pathway 2. Pathway 2 is on the table. What are those kind of performance criteria you want to set based upon the whole host of sort of engaging different levels of the supply chain. So, this was a very early one that we had made for one of our projects, but I think trying to really create some type of flow chart or decision-making process or roadmap is going to be a priority that will make this process much more executable in that respect. And then the other thing that's really interesting is, so there's the process of engagement, but then there's also this idea of redefining the team and the way that we engage the supply chain that we found has been critical on projects where we have had success across those different alternative pathways. And because typically, it's kind of a top-down approach. Architect works with a contractor who works with fabricators who work with mills and landowners. Architect rarely ever gets into the bottom of the supply chain, and even sometimes the contractor engaging mills and landowners and sort of understanding what's going on down there. And what we've seen is that having sort of this different kind of consultant, we're calling it a wood advisor, upfront to help with that kind of specification creation or roadmap or engagement is really critical to have a consultant that really has good perspective in the industry and connections to be able to start to make these asks or determine what's possible is absolutely critical. And then what we've also found is on the contractor side or trade partner side, having a similar type of wood advisor to help engagement with connecting lumber mills to landowner sources, right? Depending upon if you're doing that targeted sourcing, vetting landowner sources, helping with coordination and schedule. And then also, if you're doing segregation, there needs to be some level of tracking and verification and documentation of that tracking process to be able to make a legible claim. It's a bit ironic. It's sort of like we're recreating a certification system if we go to that full segregation with verification pathway, but it's much more inclusive and there are people out there trained to do these types of audits, to be able to do that tracking. It's just a different way to approach it that I think has a lot of value in terms of providing that origin story of the forest and what that might bring. So, I think moving forward, kind of understanding the process of engagement, I think becomes critical. And then also understanding sort of these different teaming strategies to help support that are, I think, two focus areas that we'll get into in the summit, and then hopefully continue to work on as we move forward, to help to standardize this, make it scalable, and be able to apply it across projects and across the industry. Because I think once we start to be able to make consistent asks of the supply chain as a sort of unified industry or subset of the industry, it starts to have more traction in that respect. So looking forward to the summit, and thank you for watching this video if you've chosen it, to kind of get up to speed on this and to have a more productive discussion moving forward. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop the recording. And yeah, I'll see everyone at the summit.